Hi. Hi, in this module we are going to explore seed plants, which as you can see from the slide are the dominant producers of today's planet. So yes, seed plants are definitely dominant today. All right, some striking features of seed plants. Number one, they have a greatly reduced gametophyte. So again, we talked about the moss, and in the moss, the gametophyte was dominant. Then we talked about the ferns. Here, the sporophyte was dominant and the gametophyte was reduced, but it was still visible to the naked eye. Maybe this is an inch or two in diameter. But now, today, we're going to look at the seed plants. And the seed plants are absolutely microscopic. In fact, so you might recall that the seed plants, sorry about that, include both gymnosperms and angiosperms. And for both gymnosperms and angiosperms, the male gametophyte is nothing but the pollen grain. That's how small it is. It's simply the pollen grain. And the female gametophyte, you will never see her because she hangs out inside the spore case, actually. So we have microscopic gametophytes when we're talking about the seed plants. All right, as we've already mentioned, that seed plants are heterosporous. You've seen this diagram before. And remember when we talked about ferns, so sporophytes produce spores by meiosis, and in ferns, the spore germinated into a bisexual gametophyte. Well, in alternation of generation in seed plants, we'll have a male and female gametophyte. The female develops from the megaspore, the male from the microspore. We'll come back to this diagram in just a moment. All right, awesome inventions of seed plants. Obviously, seeds. Well, what is a seed? A seed is an embryonic plant, specifically the embryonic sporophyte with a food source. And your book is an analogy of a mobile womb, all right? Because let's say in a human pregnancy, you have the embryo with the food source inside the womb, inside the uterus of the female. But a seed is mobile. The embryo and the food source takes off. Now, if we go back to this diagram, all right, basically what you will see is that the female gametophyte and the egg is a structure called an ovule, O-V-U-L-E, ovule. Sorry, I'm not O-V-U-L-E. And the egg, once it's fertilized, that becomes the zygote, and that develops by mitosis and becomes a little embryo. And then certain cells of the female's gametophyte's body becomes the food source for the growing zygote. Now, as I said, the female gametophyte really doesn't leave the spore case. So your book might refer to all of this as the ovule, but by the end, this is what you have. The female gametophyte with her eggs. Usually only one egg. All right, another awesome invention of seed plants is pollen. What is pollen? The pollen, as I said before, the pollen grain is the male gametophyte, and the pollen grain nucleus is the tail of sperm. All right, so this is what a pollen grain is. It is the male gametophyte. And again, the pollen grain nuclei are tail of sperm. So again, in seed plants, the gametophytes are not only reduced, they are microscopic. All right. So there are two types of seed plants. So these were characteristics of both types of seed plants. There are gymnosperms and angiosperms. And gymnosperms basically means a naked seed plant. There's no ovary. These are also sometimes referred to as cone-bearing plants. So let's do a little review. Remember, one member of gymnosperms are the ginkgos. They have these fan-shaped leaves. And this is a female ginkgo tree that has this like stinky seed right here. Stinky, fleshy seed. You don't want to step on this because it really stinks. And ginkgos and other conifers, remember, were dominant during the time of the dinosaurs. And conifers, anything that people use for Christmas trees. So conifers, their leaves are usually needles. Most of them are evergreens. Again, when you hear gymnosperms, think ginkgos and Christmas trees. All right, so some examples of conifers are firs, spruces, pine trees, cedars, junipers, cypress. Not only are Christmas trees, conifers are used for pulp and for making paper. All right, but conifers also include the giant sequoia trees. We've heard about the redwood forest out west. These things are huge. Just for scale, these are people here. These are full-grown humans. Yeah, these are not hobbits. These are full-grown humans, and that is the size of a sequoia tree. Isn't that amazing? Xylem does an incredible job of carrying water all the way up from the roots, all the way to the top of the leaves. And not only are conifers, some of them very, very large, some of them are very, very old. So what you see here is a picture of a bristlecone pine, and some of these trees 2, 3, some even 4,000 years old. I mean, can you imagine, time of Christ, wow, time of ancient Rome, that's when this tree was a seedling. That's incredible. So when we're talking about gymnosperms, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about ginkgos and the other conifers, or ginkgos and the conifers. All right, so here we go. We have to get down and dirty here. We have to talk about the life cycle of a gymnosperm. Sorry, and it's a little bit more complicated, but it's not too bad. All right, so when you look at a pine tree, what you call the pine tree is the sporophyte generation. So again, what you call a pine tree are actually the sporophytes, and the gametophytes are microscopic. A pine tree actually has 2 types of cones. What you probably call the pine cone is technically called the ovulate cone. And there's these little smaller cones, these softer cones, you wouldn't even think of them as cones, are the pollen cones. So, pollen cones, all right, so this is the sporophyte. These pollen cones, these lobes, are modified sporophylls, the spore leaves. And the spore leaves produce spores. And remember, all right, since we're doing male and female, the seeds that are the cells that produce the spores are not only the sporocytes, they are the microsporocytes. So let's think about it this way. Oops. The pollen grain produced the pollen, and the pollen is the male gametophytes. So the male gametophytes germinated from spores, but since they're male, we have to call them microspores. So the microspores grow into the male gametophytes, and the microsporocyte is what does meiosis. It becomes the microspores. And these microsporocytes are found on the spore leaves, which are in the pollen cones. You just sort of have to review it. All right, and meanwhile, over here is the ovulate cone, what you call a pine cone. Each little bracket of the pine cone is a spore leaf, and you have the spore case. And the spore case, all right, has a cell, the megasporocyte, that will divide by meiosis and become a megaspore, and the megaspore will grow into the female gametophyte. So again, in this little ovule, what will form is the female gametophyte and her eggs. So the pollen grain has to come along by wind, usually, all right, and the pollen grain has to go into this little bracket and find the ovule, because that way the sperm nucleus can meet the egg nucleus. So there you have the sex life of a Christmas tree. Let's go down here. So this is putting in words just what I said, just in case this will help you take notes. All right. There are 2 types of spores produced by the pine tree by the 2 different types of cones. So the ovulate cone is the female cone. What we typically call the pine cone, it's also called the seed cone. So as I said, it produces ovules. All right, since this is the female cone on the sporophyte, on the pine cones, they are the megasporocytes. The megasporocyte meiosis and forms the megaspores. Each megaspore mitosis into the female gametophyte, and the female gametophyte produces the egg. So even though all this sort of goes on in the ovule, the end result, because the megaspores actually grow into the female gametophyte, at the end, this is what you have in your ovule, the female gametophyte and her egg. Meanwhile, back in the male cone, the pollen cone, same thing. The pollen cone, right? Each little lobe is the sporophyll, right? And we know sporophytes produce spores, except since this is heterosporous, we're talking microspores. Each microspore grows into the male gametophyte, which we call the pollen grain. And the tailless sperm is the pollen tube nuclei. Da, da, da. I'll leave this up here for a second. Or you can just pause it. That's just in words to match the pictures. All right, so pollination, the little pollen grains. Again, they find their way. They have to go find their way into the seed cones, they spread a little pollen tube, and the little nucleus goes down and finds the little egg. And then the little egg divides by mitosis, germinates, and becomes, I'm sorry, getting ahead of myself. Fertilization of the pollen tube nucleus fertilizes the egg. And then the fertilized egg is called the zygote. And the zygote grows into an embryo, la-di-da. And this embryo inside the little ovule, right, there's food that has a food source. So you have the embryo and its food source. And the embryo with its food source is the seed. So again, once the egg is fertilized and becomes a little embryo, the whole thing is not an ovule anymore, it's a seed. And the question is the seed germinate and it grows into a seedling? Is the seedling the sporophyte or the gametophyte generation? Well, this pine tree seedling is the, yes, sporophyte generation. Again, the gametophyte generations are microscopic. Little female gametophyte, and on each little bracket of the pine cone, there's a little female gametophyte. And each pollen grain is a little male gametophyte, and his little sperm fertilizes her little egg, and then you have a little baby pine cone. That's it. Are we having fun yet? I have another PowerPoint with it's shorter than this, and it just shows you actual pictures of the pine cones. But what I want you to think about, remember the 3 obstacles of plants when adapting to terrestrial life. They had to overcome the need for support without water, how to avoid dehydration, and how to have sex without water. Did the pine trees overcome this obstacle? Does their sex life depend on water? I think you know the answer, but we'll review it in the next video. We'll see you there.